Donald Trump has reached the 270 electoral college votes he needs to be confirmed as the next US president, surprising many, I think, particularly outside the US. I think it's important to remember, though, that this is not an unambiguously negative event. Certainly markets have reacted that way initially, but this is not like Brexit in the UK earlier this year. Brexit was clearly an event which had substantial negative economic costs and probably political costs as well, whereas in the US election, of course, roughly half of the voting public in the US voted for Donald Trump, and he obviously has some support globally, although that's a little more difficult to define, particularly among America's traditional allies. Markets have reacted negatively because there's a lot about Donald Trump we don't know. He's never held elected office. He doesn't have a voting record. So the way he behaves initially will be extremely important as to how the next couple of days and weeks transpire. Markets' initial response has been to take the equity market down substantially. Currencies which are perceived to be negatively affected by some of Trump's policies, like the Mexican peso, also are substantially weaker. And the prospect of a Fed hike in December has been substantially pared back. That was as high as 90% over the last couple of days, and it's now much closer in market pricing to a coin toss. Now, even though there obviously are a lot of uncertainties about the new US president, he has been reasonably forthcoming about a range of policies. I think the surprising aspect is most really didn't think that we'd be considering this moment where those policies would actually be implemented. In terms of the first 100 days of a Trump presidency, we can expect a range of policies which are traditional, as well as some issues which are a little more debatable. Trump has argued that he will cut the company tax rate from 35% to 15%. He will reduce personal income tax rates substantially, particularly for working Americans. He'll repeal Obamacare, and he'll look at a range of other changes around tariffs and American companies which take jobs offshore. And in a sense, they're your range of traditional economic policies. Some of them may be a bit disruptive, but they're kind of knowns, if you like. There are also a range of other policies in terms of relations with Mexico and trade relationships, with particularly where there are a range of more significant uncertainties. Trump also, of course, has promised to deport illegal immigrants in the US, and practically, of course, there are a range of substantial questions around that. So the reality is we will have to see how President Trump behaves as opposed to candidate Trump. I mean, exactly his turn of phrase and how he treats the media and the rest of the elected government, both in Congress and the Senate, will be important. Stepping back a little bit, there's a pattern here, unfortunately. We've had Brexit this year, we had Trump's rise, sustained candidacy, and now election as US president. We had the election of Duterte in the Philippines. We also had close to a hung parliament in Australia. There's clearly a pattern here of political surprise across elected democracies this year. Most are putting this down to what I call the conventional explanation of questions about equality, income distribution, and a bit of a blowback against globalisation, and in some cases immigration. And it's hard to divorce these events from those drivers, but those drivers don't explain everything we've seen. They don't explain Trump's role as a relatively wealthy person, but yet being supported by people who feel disenfranchised. They don't explain the change in the Philippines presidency this year, an economy which has clearly been a beneficiary of globalisation. It's clear to us that there's a change in the way information is shared now, and a change in the way, as a result, the debate is conducted. We released a piece earlier this month called The Paradox of 50-50 Politics, which argues just that, in fact, that the rise of social media and other forms of informal communication mean that those parts of society actually, who for long periods of history haven't supported globalisation and haven't necessarily supported free trade, now find they have a voice and a collective sense of ownership. And I think they've found the strength to express those views through the ballot box. That also means that we've probably passed the peak of globalisation and we're likely to face a more difficult and fractious political environment going forwards. Expect surprises in that sense, and markets are pricing accordingly.